gather ourselves into community with 3 deep breaths. So breathe in and breathe out. And breathe in and breathe out. And one more time. Breathe in and breathe out. Thank you all.
Good morning. I am delighted to welcome you here this morning. My name is Margot Page, and I am your worship associate today. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. Gail and I are joined by our special guests, Greg Berg and Dominique Mazot. This morning, we're happy to have Chris Ishii on the piano while Lydia's away. We're also grateful, so grateful for our tech team, Michael, Jim, and John, the wonderful greeters, the folks who make the coffee, our security folks, and the office staff. All of them help make this morning happen. So we're going to continue with our opening song, number 21, For the Beauty of the Earth.
And let's sing loud so we pull any stragglers into the room. Friends, please be seated. Our theme this month of June is freedom. Freedom from fear and freedom from want. Freedom to gather, to organize, to speak out, to worship. Freedom to be who we are and love who we love. Freedom to dream of a more inclusive future and to create that dream together. Anna Bladel writes, "What if freedom, instead of being an impossible demand or a future fantasy, is what effloresces, what blooms forth as we turn toward one another, bearing witness and practicing withness, enfleshing the sacred through fierce and tender care, and practicing spirit as the wild love that makes possible what we are told is impossible, survival with joy and collective liberation. What if living with love at our center is the path to freedom?
Please light your chalice at home as we light ours here. These words are from Reverend J. Wolin. As we come together, let us remember those who have come before us, both known and unknown, and sacrificed so we could have the opportunities we have. Let us think about those yet to come, both known and unknown, and the world we will leave them. Let us act with our values, the impact of which is both known and unknown. Let us move forward with hope for a world we can imagine and one we cannot fathom. As we light this chalice, let it light the path as we move forward in worship together in freedom.
Thank you. There's a reading in our hymnal that's used in many congregations as a covenant and recited every Sunday. Many of you will recognize it. It goes like this: love is the doctrine of this church. The quest for truth is its sacrament, and service is its prayer. To dwell together in peace, to seek knowledge in freedom, to serve humanity in fellowship, till the end that all souls shall grow into harmony. Thus do we covenant with each other. When the Unitarian Universalist Association General Assembly delegates voted last year to revise the language of Article 2 and put love as the center of our faith, we drew on a strong Universalist heritage and a set of deep activist roots. We anchored ourselves in our commitment to inclusion and to democratic process. The change was that rather than focusing on how we are different from our other brothers and sisters in faith around the world and around the country, we leaned into what we hold in common: our love expressed through our values and our actions. Now, when the Unitarians and Universalists consolidated back in 1961, it was pretty commonplace to identify the Unitarians as the head and the Universalists as the heart. When the principles were articulated in the 1980s, this merged faith was trying to articulate a way of being in religious community that would allow both theists and non-theists to worship and live and work together. They wanted a religious community with space for reason, and so they used language about choice and principled action, rather than language about emotional connection or belief. So in our Unitarian Universalist principles, our Unitarian ancestry is particularly visible in this new articulation of our identity, this love at the center way of framing things and the values that flow from that. Our Universalist heritage is what's stepping forward. And we begin practicing and learning how to speak in a language of love and the values that guide our expression of that love in the world. Putting love at the center and using values language to discuss our tradition offers us a new way to engage this faith that is precious to so many of us. It's an invitation to embody it, not just think about it. Francis David, quoting John Wesley, in the Transylvanian court of King John Sigismund, the only Unitarian monarch in history, reminded us then, and I will remind us now, that we do not have to think alike to love alike. And that if we hold on to that common sense of love, then no disagreement or difference in perception will harm us in the long haul. In loving alike, in centering love, in leading with our hearts, well, we're going to see ourselves reflected everywhere. Love at the center is at the core of nonviolent activism. You're going to be able to find it in the pages of books you're reading. Father Greg Boyle's Cherished Belonging, The Healing Power of Love in Divided Times is one that I quoted from, a few months ago. Rivera Sun's Dandelion Insurrection. You'll find love at the center permeating websites like Pace Ibene or Braver Angels. And you'll even find it in places you don't expect it, like Indivisible's instructions on how to behave at the No Kings rally. Recognizing and naming love as our center puts us in explicit alignment with a host of other organizations, both religious and secular, working to nonviolently secure people's lives and rights, to protect our planet and our shared future. Now, to move effectively in the world, we Unitarian Universalists are going to need all of our resources. Yes, we need to lead with love. We need our Universalist side, but we also need our Unitarian side. We need our hearts and we need our minds, and we need both hands. Remember a couple of weeks ago, saying stop to what is not acceptable and saying, tell me your story, to invite the other in. Now, this is hard. And so we have to practice. Because when you are startled, when we are startled, it's really easy to default and be reactive and to not trust and to be in that place of self-protection and justification and anger. Many of you will have heard me say, don't surprise people. Surprised people behave badly. right? They don't behave badly because they are bad people, but when we are surprised, we are self-protective, right? And when that happens, it's tempting to lash out, when what would really make the most positive difference would be to turn toward one another in witness and witness. I thought that was a lovely phrase. Now, I don't know about you, but this past week, I had a chance to practice. Hearing that big changes were in store for the Interfaith Shelter shocked many who are here in this room. And it isn't a done deal yet, but it seems imminent. But I would like us, before we respond and release all the angst that we have pent up inside for any of a dozen different reasons, from actions of the current administration in Washington to the state of our retirement funds to the fact that programming for scientists we love has just evaporated. Before we react and release the angst that we have pent up inside from all of those things and rail against the city or rail against Pete's Place or rail at Urban Alchemy, let's remember that we're actually on the same side. The current staff at the Interfaith Shelter want to serve our unhoused neighbors. They have been working hard to do that for years now. They have been expanding their programming. They want to make a positive difference. And the folks at the city also want to make a positive difference. They want our unhoused neighbors to be housed and supported and cared for. They want to prevent additional addiction. They want to respond to the fentanyl crisis and to the immediate neighbors of Pete's Place and to the fact that housing is really hard to come by in Santa Fe, even if you've got money. And of course, the folks at Urban Alchemy, which is the nonprofit proposed to run the shelter, also has as its mission to help people who are not housed. They have a pretty good track record of getting folks off the street in other cities. They're imperfect, and we don't know them yet. If we put love at the center, it doesn't mean we agree. We can remember that even people who care deeply can come to different assessments about what the right path is to take. It isn't easy to lead with our hearts and bring our heads along. So, this morning, I want to invite all of us to take the situation around Pete's Place as an opportunity for practice, to remember the most important people in the room every time we hear a conversation have to be the unhoused individuals we are trying to serve. What combination of programs and services and volunteers and paid staff and sites will best help them? I invite us to lead with compassion and curiosity. And, I've said many times that actually I have a very Unitarian understanding of love. I don't think of love primarily as an emotion. I think of love as a commitment that we make to act in support of the well-being of our beloveds. All right? A commitment to act in support of the well-being of our beloveds. As we move forward through the week, in participating and listening to the public conversation that's already begun, let's keep love and the well-being of our unhoused neighbors at the center of our thinking and at the center of our actions. Thank you.
These stones remind us that a peaceful world, a healthy planet, and a robust democracy will become realities only when we and other good-hearted people around the world work together to unravel racism, mend generational patterns of violence, fight for democracy, and learn to live peacefully and regeneratively on our planet. May we find joy and meaning in these struggles.
Almost every Sunday morning, we set aside a time for the sharing of our sorrows and joys, the milestones in our lives. We know that joys that are shared are multiplied. We are aware that sorrows that are shared are easier to bear. And so we only have one entry in the book today, and we already talked about that. The Interfaith Shelter needs our support. Please contact the mayor and the councilors prior to the meeting on Tuesday. Our unhoused community counts on faith community support. All right, but there are birthdays and joys. Jim Aspero, Sue Gee, and Ken Kurtz celebrate birthdays this week. We wish all of them a very happy birthday. There are cards in the foyer for Ken Kurtz, who will be turning 94. Please stop after the service and sign in. We also have cards on the writing table for Carol Matheson. Carol is recovering after a stroke last weekend. She has nothing but praise for her caretakers and her friends who stepped up and is now recovering at home and is so glad to be alive. And we have visitors, yay. That's one of the cool things about being in Santa Fe. We get visitors from all over the country, all over the world, and it's just lovely to see them. We have with it, now, if you feel like it and I call your name, wave. If you're an introvert, that's okay, you don't have to wave, but not waving does not guarantee that someone won't come up and talk to you after the service. So, just so you know. Richard Kelly from Santa Fe is here. Hello, Richard. Voxy Amavila from Phoenix is here. Tamara Amavila. Okay. Julie Lipton, here from Austin. Tevis is here, Bear. Tevis is an old friend, there she is. And Cameron, yay, Tevis and Cameron. And Vivian is there somewhere, yes, and Alexis. Lovely to have all of you with us here today. So let's light one more candle, if you will, for the sorrows and joys we have shared this morning and for those that we carry still unspoken in the silent recesses of our hearts. And now, if you would, let's sing Spirit of Life. If you need lyrics, it's 1, 2, 3 in the gray hymnal, but you know, you can just hum along. Resting now on the echoes of the music, let's move into a time of quiet and contemplation. I invite you to close your eyes if that's comfortable for you, to take a deep breath, and to consciously allow your body to relax. Let go of any tension or tiredness, any anxiety or dis-ease that you might be carrying. Breathe. And as you exhale, let your thoughts drift. Feel your heart start to soften and open. Let it unfold until it can cradle all of the emotions, all of the sorrow and anxiety and worry and anger and joy and hope that flow through us in these times. Breathe. And as we rest together in the quiet, remember that we are not alone. You are not alone. Let yourself be aware of the other people breathing in the room, of the allies and friends watching online. Breathe. I'm going to offer you, as we rest in the quiet, some words from Rivera's son in her book, The Roots of Resistance. Just beyond the edge of ordinary sight, love churns as vast as plate tectonics and as powerful as earthquakes. It presses against the edges of reality, seeking to crack the barriers of awareness that block it. This great love, the kind that sears the soul and hauls us back from human folly, this love reverberating in revolutions of the heart, this love that scorches cruelty away as it rises, this love that breaks our hearts and turns out its contents to those in need. Life wants to live, but more than that, it wants to love. Simple survival is not enough. Mere procreation leaves mothers turning their faces to the wall and fathers hanging from the rafters. Fallen in the wastelands, thirst alone may leave us collapsed, abandoning our bodies for the vultures. But love, for the hope of saving our children, seeing our beloved, or protecting our communities, we stagger to our feet and stumble forward. To save her granddaughter, an elderly woman can find the strength to lift a crushing vehicle. For his father, a son plunges into the flames of a burning house. We shoulder the unbearable, accomplish the impossible, and endure the unthinkable through the intensity of our love. These stories of love emerge on every continent, in every town. They are multiplied by millions, and they create a song of life louder than the small-hearted survivalists and richer than the deathmongers and their addictions. More enduring than despair, more grounded than hope, this song reverberates in the genetic strands of humanity, woven into the biological structure of human life. Deep in history, our foremothers loved their children. Far in the future, our descendants love their families. And in this present moment, which hangs like a bead of dew on the grass stem of time, where the life of the planet lies clouded by question marks and the body of humanity sprawls in a wasteland of our own making, the love song of our ancestors and our descendants calls us to rise. The hymn of life hums in the throats of our brothers and sisters. The chords of evolution roar and bark and howl and hiss and warble and moan from the tongues of fellow animals. The wind strikes the harpstrings of the forests and the marshes, the prairies and the mountains. And the great timpani of the coast booms and crashes across the cymbals of the sands and the drum barrels of the rocks. All we need to do is listen. The love song of the world enters our souls through the language of life. Our touchstone of strength forms the shape of our beloveds. Courage surges into our limbs. We rise. We step in the direction of change. This is the love that thrusts the world through eternity and carries us forward into the infinity of tomorrow. It sings overhead, scouring the barriers of reality and looking for an opening. Let it in. Let it in.
Good morning. I'm Greg Berg, and the three of us are facilitators of small group ministry here at UU Santa Fe. There's actually a fourth member of our team, Shelley Griffey, who could not be with us here this morning. So we're going to spend a few minutes sharing some information about the small group ministry program, and also talk about our own personal experiences participating both as members of groups and as facilitators. So I'm going to go first, and then Dominique and Margot. As the name implies, small group ministry supports the concept of shared ministry in UU congregations. They embody the principle that ministry is not solely the work of ordained clergy, but a collective responsibility and an opportunity for all members of the congregation. Small group ministry programs are a practical and powerful way that UU churches live out the concept of shared ministry. making every member and every gathering an opportunity for spiritual growth. Small group ministry fosters deep connection and community. Small groups provide a setting where members can listen and be listened to, share personal stories, and build meaningful relationships. This sense of belonging and mutual care is foundational to shared ministry, as it creates a supportive environment where everyone's voice and presence matters. Small group ministry encourages spiritual growth for all and extends ministry beyond Sunday worship. It provides a structure for ongoing engagement among members. Now, small group ministry has become a cornerstone of congregational life in most UU communities. Sometimes the groups are called chalice circles or covenant groups. These groups really started to expand in the 1980s. In the early 1990s, the UUA started using the umbrella term small group ministry. I was in my first small group ministry in 1995. Man, I'm really old. At the Unitarian Society of Hartford. And I started facilitating a few years after that. So I've been involved in small group ministry for about 30 years, and it's become one of my most important and my most valuable spiritual practices. The early 2000s saw a rapid adoption of small group ministry across UU churches nationwide. In 2004, the UU Small Group Ministry Network was founded to support all the congregations implementing these programs. It allows for the sharing of resources and the developing best practices. In 2013, when I was at the Unitarian Society of New Haven, Connecticut, I created a small group ministry program called What I Believe. This program includes about 50 session plans. Here at UU Santa Fe, we launched the What I Believe program about 19 months ago. And we now have 4 facilitators, as I mentioned, and we've had 10 groups so far. I know many of you here today have been in one or more of those groups. Now we are extending this program to a new 6-session small group ministry called Love at the Center. And that's why we're having this chat today as part of the Love at the Center theme of the worship service. I'll close my part of this conversation by saying a few words about what you can expect if you participate in a small group here, and what you can expect in each of the sessions. Each of the groups typically have 6 to 8 participants and 1 or 2 trained facilitators. The groups have what we call open enrollment, and then they run for 6 sessions. Then that group ends, and there is open enrollment for the next group. This is meant to foster a sense of inclusivity for all members of the community. They're open groups, they're not closed groups. Each of the 6 sessions has the same format, and they typically last about 1.5 hours. When participants arrive, they are given a session plan, an actual document for that session. For example, the first session topic for the Love at the Center group is interdependence. We begin the session with opening words and a chalice lighting. We then do an individual check-in. We tend to follow these questions when we check in. What are you leaving behind in order to be fully present? With what thoughts or feelings have you been preoccupied? We then have a period of silent reflection, a moment to quiet ourselves. We then pick up the session document that we've all been given a copy of, and we take turns reading out loud a series of short readings on the topic. After the readings, the facilitator offers a series of questions, one by one, and participants share their responses to those questions. That's sort of the main part of each session. When we're finished with that, when there seems to be a natural ending to the sharing, we extinguish our chalice with some closing words. At the very end, we have a brief time for what we call likes and wishes. What haven't you said that you feel you really need to say before we break? What have you liked or wished for from this gathering? And what are you taking away from this session? So that's the likes and wishes, and after that we break. And so that's the format for each of the 6 sessions. That's what you can sort of expect if you were to be in a group. Now, in the very first session, we do something else. We pass around and we review our covenant. So we actually have a written covenant for the What I Believe small group ministry and now the Love at the Center groups. And I won't go into details of the covenant, but I'd like to mention a few things because it will really give you a sense of what it's like during the sessions. For example, when sharing in response to the facilitator questions, we do our best to speak about our own personal feelings and experiences rather than abstract opinions or the feelings or experiences of others. Now, as facilitators, one of the ways we encourage that is by asking the participants to begin their sharing with I statements. We also refrain from commenting either positively or negatively on things that other group members have shared. And we refrain from giving advice to other group members as part of the sharing. One of my favorite parts of the covenant is that we allow a period of silence, perhaps 2 or 3 breaths, after the previous person speaks, before the next person speaks. 2 or 3 breaths can feel like a long time, given the normal ways that we interact with one another. So in these small group ministry sessions, we welcome stillness and periods of silence. Those are some of the key features that are incorporated in the covenant and some of the key features that are part of the sessions. We have one Love at the Center group that you may have seen in the e-news that's starting this Wednesday that Dominique and I are co-facilitating. That group is full. Shelley Griffey, the 4th of our facilitators, is ready to facilitate a second group on Love at the Center if there's enough interest. If we get 2 or 3 more people to sign up, we'll have enough people for this second group. And that group will start on Thursday and run for 6 Thursdays at 3:30. So if you're interested in signing up for that group, Thursdays at 3:30, I'll be standing around after church and you can just let me know or send me an email, but it would have to be in the next day or so. I'll now turn over things to Dominique, who will do some sharing about her experiences.
My first experience of church at La Sainte Trinité in the parish of my childhood was very impersonal and lonely. There was no sense of belonging that I, the forlorn child of divorced parents, was craving. No family community, no church community. At UU, I had a first taste of community when 2 years ago I attended an environmental groups meeting. Then, as soon as I became AUU, I visited the Mystics group, something hopeful because it connected with my self-arisen spiritual path, which a friend refers to as garden mysticism. The small group ministry resonated even more because it's about deep listening, which in my experience is a practice deepening the spiritual path, the most important matter of my life. For a colorful aside, here's a parable Swedish author Henning Mankell learned in Africa. Why do human beings have 2 ears but 1 tongue? Probably so that we have to listen twice as much as we speak. Listening is one of the foundations of a spiritual path. It emphasizes the importance of mindful, present, and compassionate hearing to understand another person or even oneself, like listening to one's inner voice through certain types of meditation. In Buddhism, the 4th precept is deep listening and loving speech. For Quakers, it is a very serious business. Douglas V. Steere calls it holy listening. Quote, to listen another soul into life, into a condition of disclosure and discovery, may be almost the greatest service that any human being ever performs for another. From the lay theologian and activist William Stringfellow are some relevant words. Listening is a rare happening among human beings. You cannot listen to the word another is speaking if you are preoccupied with your appearance or with impressing the other, or are trying to decide what you're going to say when the other stops talking, or are debating about whether what is being said is true or relevant or agreeable. Such matters have their place, but only after listening to the word as the word is being uttered. Stringfellow continues, listening is a primitive art of love in which a person gives himself to another's word, making himself accessible and vulnerable to that word, unquote. Interestingly, in the 90s, deep listening came into my life both in an activist group and then an art-oriented one. Since 1990, I've been a member of People for Peace, a grassroots community whose practice is listening, study, and action. We model participatory democracy by listening to everyone in the room each time we meet. Can you believe that? After 5 minutes of silence, then individuals speak, but only once until all those who wish to speak have a turn. Others listen with full attention. There is no crosstalk, a pause of silence after each speaker magnifies the words of each person, giving the speaker and those listening time to reflect on what has just been said. In the early days, we were an assorted group, including a couple of borderline characters. It was amazing to see how this listening practice calmed them down and contributed to greater harmony. By the way, what is so hopeful in today's world is that many groups are leaning towards such holistic techniques. Some examples, Global Listening Center, to see the future society as a world that listens well before acting, that's their mission. The Co-Intelligent Institute, when I first encountered it in the 90s, it had listening to our neighbors' projects, whereby trained listeners went door to door asking community members heartful questions about controversial public issues. And then the Compassionate Listening Project teaches heart-based skills for peace building and reconciliation and refers to these projects as listening journeys. My interest in the spiritual in art in our time led me to composer, performer, educator Pauline Oliveros, who developed a practice of deep listening early on, connecting the universe of sound and processing what one hears. The aural moment, aural spelled A-U-R-A-L. I had to check that. Being the conduit to expanded awareness. We're so fortunate to have the opportunity to fine-tune our listening in our small ministry group. As Mayan elder Carlos Barrios said, find your heart and you will find your way. Thank you. Ms. Margot.
We are really alive when we listen to each other, to the silences of each other, as well as to the words and what lies behind the words. So says Frederick Buechner. Well, you've heard the logistics of small group ministry from Greg and the beauty of deep listening from Dominique. And I've been participating in small groups for over 25 years, and I'd like to tell you why. So, over this period of time, I've come to hold deep listening to others as a spiritual practice. For me, it's a meditative experience, in a sense, as I ask myself to listen to my group mates with an open heart, without thoughts of judgment or questioning or suggestions or a need to fix. And this is not easy. It's not easy for me. Sometimes as I relax into my session and into my seat, I feel this sense of my heart opening to the person speaking and love and empathy flowing from me, just being present and looking at them. But you know what? Other times I have to actively work to clear my mind of all the stuff we have, and to be present and to be open. And I have to do it again and again and again as we sit together in a group like this, around a table or just together. I have to reassure myself that the beloved speaker has everything they need to figure out whatever problem or concern, and that the greatest gift that I can give is to be fully present without any other thoughts, just being there as a witness, and just deeply listen to communication. And, I need to practice deep listening so that I can be present or activate that state in my life at other times. You know the adages that practice makes perfect, and what we most need to learn, we need to practice. So, over 25 years, I've gotten pretty good at listening to my friends in this way outside of church. I feel like I'm really good in our sessions most of the time. And, I have 2 adult children, but those of you who have raised kids, sometimes it's not as easy to listen as you want it to be. But I feel like I've gotten really pretty good. But you know what? Some of you know my husband who's here, Ian, and it's really hard. I have to bring that, the most beloved person in my life, I have to keep practicing this. So, in small groups, we get to practice what we want to live into our world and our life more. So that's one reason, just spiritual practice of deep listening. The other thing is, Dominique touched on this, but I've been a member of 2 UU churches, UU Santa Monica and UU Santa Fe. And for me, going to coffee hour and working on committees and all of those things, it's a really great way to get to know people in a certain way. But when you sit down and you have the shared readings about a subject and you come together with the commitment to try your best to be present and to listen to experiences, it's a whole different level of getting to know somebody. So, there are many different subjects in our groups, and Greg mentioned some. We've done balance and commitment and deep listening, gratitude, generosity, and acceptance. There are many, many subjects, but we all have different experiences from our work lives, our young lives, just wise words and to share and things to work out. So in both of the churches I've belonged to in my life as a UU, getting to know people in that way, being present and having them present for me, is a way to get to know people for me in a much deeper way. Really getting to know the essence of somebody. And, one of our commitments to each other is confidentiality. And so trusting that what's said in our group stays in our group, and that you can be open and honest and work things out. And part of confidentiality is not holding someone to what they said 3 months ago. Life changes, people change. We talk through things to figure out things, or some of us do. Some of us don't talk until we've figured it out, but that's not me. Then the last thing I wanted to share is that, small group ministry, whatever it's been called, is a values-based program. And Gail talked today about our value of love at the center and asked us to think about how we act through that love in a community challenge that's coming up, that there are lots of opinions about. And so, as I've participated in small groups, and my old church did it in the church years, so I have, before I moved to Santa Fe, over 20 years of yearly practice in this. These programs help me figure out my values and help me develop more of who I am in UU values. How do I put those values into practice, and how can I live more fully? And listening to other people's experiences and the way they put their values into action, helps me. I have given you 3 reasons why I do this. There's so many more, and people who have participated here will tell you about their experiences. But you've heard that there are 2 groups that we hope to launch this week. We need 2 or 3 more people to have Shelley's group go. And then Shelley and I are going to do another group that we're going to co-facilitate it mid-July through mid-August. And as soon as I sat down with Erin and looked at rooms and dates and all of that it'll be in the afternoons. And we hope you will come join us. If you'd like to get to know yourself better and your fellow UU travelers better, please sign up for one of the small groups. Thank you for listening to us. Thank you.
Move to the end of our service. It has 3 parts. We are going to have our first Sunday giving guests. So I need 2 people to come forward, our guest. And Katie, will you come up and introduce him? Oh, Mary Ellen is introducing him. Thank you. So Mary Ellen, come on around. Don't seal the envelopes, please, because we actually take the money out of the envelope, give it to the person, and then use the envelopes again next time. I have not coached you on that. If you already sealed it, don't worry about it. We've ordered more envelopes, but just for future reference. After we do First Sunday Giving, we have offering words from Roberta, who's going to give us an update on some of the stuff going on. Then we're going to extinguish our chalice and have our benediction. Think we have about 7 or 8 minutes then to do all of that, friends. If you can be patient, we appreciate it if you stay to the end. If you have to cut out quickly, we absolutely understand that you might need to do that. Mary Ellen.
Good morning. I'm Mary Ellen Gonzalez, and I'm the convener of your Justice Council. I have worked with Somos Un Pueblo Unido for many years. They are an immigrants' rights and workers' rights group. They are flexible enough so that they can meet current needs, whatever they are. A couple of things that they've done in the past, they've worked to make sure that everyone who drives on New Mexico public roads has access to insurance and knows the rules of the road. And they work to be sure that if someone works, they get paid for the work they did, fairly, according to laws. They work to support families. So if you want to support them, please put your donation into a green envelope. Now, they're led by immigrants themselves, so they respond to the needs of that community. And here to tell you what they currently are focusing on is Gabriel Aracon Macias.
Perfect. Hello, everyone. Good morning. Still morning? Good morning. Thanks for having me. So a little bit about Somos Un Pueblo Unido. Well, first, I want to start off going back to what was said previously about Freedom Month and the freedom to get rid of fear within our communities. So that's the root cause of Somos Un Pueblo Unido, to grow power amongst our immigrant communities in the state of New Mexico and working with allies in the country to get rid of this fear during the current political climate. So that was almost perfectly linked. And it's very nice to have that in mind, carrying that with us and to get rid of that fear that sometimes, prevents us from meeting loved ones and fully, living to our full potential. And so amongst, this political climate and immigration policy, changes amongst the government, separation of families, threatening communities, Somos Un Pueblo Unido works directly in New Mexico in 8 counties, mainly focused and mainly centered in the south of the state where the Permian Basin is located, Roswell, Hobbs, or Artesia. A lot of our immigrant communities and drivers of our organization work directly in the oil and gas industry. And so to provide support to those communities, ways in which their families can be benefited and properly, taken care of with the political climate is of utmost importance during this time. A little bit about Somos. We were founded in 1995, so we turned 30 this year. And it's been 30 good years of, passing laws and really speaking up for our communities in New Mexico directly. Like I mentioned, we are in 8 counties, Santa Fe being our base hub, and we are spreading and we're growing consistently due to the rise of, the political climate. We hope to spread in Taos and Española, even out towards Las Vegas, but we are mainly centered in the center of the state. We do have a workers' center, which Mary Ellen briefly touched upon, working directly with salary theft, raising the minimum wage every single year during the month of March. We've been conducting very, very consistently workers' rights presentations all over the state, whether it's working with churches and schools and different communities to spread reliable information of how to practice and exercise your rights. It's surprising the amount of people that are interested in learning and being in these conversations. And it's as simple as, our First Amendment of gathering, such as we are right now, and exercising the right to remain silent in certain situations. I do have with me, and I'll put up front, some Know Your Rights cards. If you guys want to, you're free to make copies of, and, give to communities that you guys would see benefited by these cards. But at the root of our organization, we do a lot of work at the legislative session. And so this past legislative session, which was a longer session, the 60-day session, we were able to pass 3 of our proposed legislative bills and proposals, which is a big win for Somos Un Pueblo Unido. One of them being, like Mary Ellen mentioned, the privacy bill, which is SB 36. It limits the disclosure of our sensitive personal information. We did a study with UNM directly based on immigration status that would limit the sharing of our personal and confidential information. Through these studies, we found out that agencies like the MVD were directly selling our information, packaging them to data brokers like LexisNexis and bigger organizations, and then they would essentially sell that information and it would land in the hands of ICE. And so through these studies and through this, constant notion of the violation of our rights, we pushed this bill and it was signed by the governor, which was a big win for us. But I'll be here to, speak on any questions you guys may have. And we just want to thank our partners such as the UU to, have us and work with us and, spreading this information. And just want to say thank you so much.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, guys, you know what to do. Put a bill in the envelope. If we have about 100 people in the room, maybe 115. If everybody puts in a 5, that's a lot of money. If everybody puts in a 10, if even more. Some people can only afford to put in a 1, that's fine. I'm waiting for us to find a couple $100 bills, all right? Let's see what we can do. Roberta, where are you, my friend? We have a couple of updates on things coming up. We'll pass the baskets another time for your offering, and we'll go from there.
Okay, so if you haven't figured it out, I'm Roberta Armstrong, Secretary of the Board of Trustees. So what's on our minds this week is the annual meeting, which is actually next Sunday. But today, if you can't attend that meeting, we have a proxy form so your vote can be counted. The link was in the email that was sent out with all of the documents, and my apologies for sending the wrong candidate list the first time, but you now have the right one. If you have questions about your voting status, if your name wasn't on that list that was sent out, see me after church and we'll figure it out. But today is our annual meeting town hall. So the people who are going to be on the agenda for the meeting, like Connie, I think you're coming, Jim will be there, Sherry is chair of the nominating committee, and John Lehman is in the back, who's the vice president for finance. They'll all be there to answer questions about these agenda items that we're going to be voting on. And Gail, I think you'll be there. You can speak to First Sunday Giving if Katie can't stay. So that's kind of where we're at with that. Quick update on the pledge drive. I've got the posters out in the hallway. So far we have 177 pledges totaling $315,871 to be precise, which is 90.2% of our goal. Now, this is not at the goal, which we would like to get to, but compared to last year when we had 275,000 in pledges, we are way above that. So I really thank everybody who has stepped up for that. And then you probably know the mega sale is this week. And today really is the last day to drop off items because, as you can see, we have a huge job starting tomorrow at 8:30. Interestingly enough, we are short of volunteers on Friday and Saturday for the sale itself. We're not asking you to clean everything up. We've got a pretty good crew for that. But we need people to be present and help shoppers and things like that. So if you have some availability on Friday or Saturday, just let me know your name and I'll be in touch and tell you what the openings are. And then don't forget to come and shop and tell your friends too. So all of these things that I've talked about represent your participation in our community. It's critical to our success, and we deeply appreciate your support, whether it's your time, your talents, and your financial contributions. So we will now gratefully accept the morning offering. And you put the green envelopes in too.
So I think the green envelopes went out. I don't know that the baskets came back in. So while can someone go and check that? Let's let Chris play a little bit of music. Chris?
We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we're together again.
Thank you. All right, friends. You're invited to rise and bump elbows or take hands, whatever feels comfortable, and to repeat after me. May love and skill be in our hands. May love and courage fill our hearts. May love and wisdom light our minds. May love flow through us and walk among us. As we live our lives and work to heal our world. Amen, shalom, namaste, blessed be. Assalamu alaikum, ashe, aho. Thank you, friends. Have a wonderful week. You're welcome to stay for the town hall or do whatever you have on your schedule this afternoon. Good to see you, Rick. Nice to see you. Chris is gone. Thank you for joining us today, friends. We hope that you enjoyed today's service. Please take a little time and explore our website and visit our online welcome table if you'd like to know more about us. Otherwise, we'll see you next Sunday morning. Stay in touch and be well.